a 3-day series of lectures, 3 hours each, on liberty. John Mills's concept of liberty. But because of getting into the weather, we abbreviated it to 1 day. So for the first hour, he's actually going to talk about Gaza and Palestine from a historical perspective. And for the next 2 hours, we can eat bagels and coffee and talk about Venezuela, talk about Greenland, or at least people get confused apparently, and talk about any questions that you might have on American foreign policy, freedom of expression, the concept of utopia. He has another series of lectures on that. The first hour will largely focus specifically on the historical perspective of Gaza. So he has been doing around before. We hope that he will come for next winter and spend the winter with us. I'm assured that it's not usually like this. So feel free to ask questions in the second half of the talk. If he's welcome on Finkelstein to the rocket.
Well, thank you for, excuse me, I have to turn it on. You hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you for having me. And what I want to do in the first hour is just to review some aspects of what happened since October 7th, 2023. And at the end, look at the most recent development, which in a way I think marks the end of the process that began, let's call it the provisional end of the process that began on October 7th, 2023. The first point I believe to be made in trying to understand what happened is that many of the questions that arose on October 7th and thereafter, many of the questions I believe were incorrectly posed. And in a sense, you could say the answer was rigged by the nature of the question. So let's take the most basic example of that. It was what came to be called the Pierce-Morgan question. Namely, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th, on the 7th of October? Do you condemn it? If the question is posed in that way, it's very hard, especially within the constraints of an interview, it's very hard to answer no. That merely saying no effectively disqualifies you from the conversation. However, I believe if the question were correctly posed, then you can say no without disqualifying yourself from the spectrum of reasonable opinion. So, how does one answer that question? I think the first thing to do is you have to place what happened on October 7th in its context. And the context goes back, you can say, some people want to go back further, but I believe it's adequate to go back to 1948. When Israel is created simultaneously with its creation, the indigenous population of the area called Palestine, the indigenous population was largely expelled, or you could say overwhelmingly expelled, of the Palestinian Arabs living in what came to be called the State of Israel. The total number, roughly 90% were expelled by the end of the first Arab-Israeli War. The end is usually dated at about March 1949. Of that 90% of Palestinians who were expelled, roughly 280,000 ended up in Gaza. There was a large number who ended up in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, and as I said, a considerable number, about 280,000 of the total is usually put. The total number of expellees is usually put at 750,000. So about 280,000 of those 750,000 ended up in Gaza. So the first point to bear in mind in trying to understand what happened on October 7th, the first point to bear in mind is that Gaza was and remained an overwhelmingly refugee population. Under international law, the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of refugees are classified as refugees under international law. So you could say the estimate is of the population of Gaza in October 2023, roughly 80% were refugees or classified as refugees under international law. Now, Gaza, right after the 1948 war, Gaza came under Egyptian administration. Egypt did not annex Gaza. However, it did assert political control over Gaza. And it wasn't a pretty picture, for sure. Already, one notices in the early 1950s, that it's being described, Gaza, this is long before Israel came to control Gaza. Already it's being described as, in the words of the senior UN official in Gaza, it's being described as a concentration camp. That phrase comes from E.L.N. Burns, who was, as I said, the senior UN official in the region. Now, I didn't explain why there were UN officials in the region, because after the war, there was a relief organization set up for the refugees. It's called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, and its head was E.L.N. Burns. After 1967, in the course of the war, 1967, Israel came to occupy Gaza as well as the West Bank and significant other territories, the Egyptian Sinai, the Syrian Golan Heights, but we won't be talking about it today. They came to occupy Gaza. And once again, it's very striking that the phrase used to describe the situation in Gaza, the recurrent phrase, is it's a concentration camp. So you have the case of, most of you will remember the presidential candidate in 2000, Al Gore. Al Gore's father was also a senator, and he went to Israel and the occupied territories after '67, and when he came back to give congressional testimony, he described Gaza, this is in July 1967, a month after the war ended. He described Gaza in congressional testimony, excuse me. He described Gaza as a concentration camp. If we fast forward a bit to 2004, we have the testimony of the head of Israel's National Security Council, somebody named Giora Eiland. And Eiland was and is anything but a peacenik or a pacifist. He's a rather nasty fellow by any reckoning. But Eiland, in conversation with U.S. diplomats, when he had to describe Gaza, he said, quote, Gaza, it's a huge concentration camp. Bear in mind that Giora Eiland's description of Gaza came in 2004. That was before Israel imposed its criminal blockade of Gaza. Once Israel imposed its blockade of Gaza, the already harsh conditions there significantly deteriorated. Israel drew up a list of items that were inadmissible to Gaza, including chocolate, potato chips, condiments, spices, a very long list. In fact, the list was so long, it was finally decided to just produce a list of things, of items that were admitted into Gaza. And that blockade, it had its variations over time. However, there was a consistency in the course of the variations. So, you have a concentration camp compounded by a medieval blockade. But that's not the whole picture, because on top of that, there were the periodic Israeli killing sprees in Gaza, what Israel called its operations, and what it more informally called its mowings of the lawn in Gaza. And in the course of each of these high-tech killing sprees, large numbers of civilians were killed. The numbers of children fell roughly in the range of, say, 350 to 550 children, depending upon the operation. And there was a huge amount of deliberate destruction of the civilian objects, homes, schools, hospitals. Very little that occurred after October 7th. Very little. I'm straining my mind to think of something that was different. Very little was different after October 7th in Gaza, apart from the obvious, namely the quantity, the magnitude. And it's a commonplace that quantity turns into quality, and so what happened after October 7th has to be described as something different, but on the other hand, nothing after October 7th, nothing lacked a precedent on a smaller scale, but a precedent before October 7th. After October 7th, by now the numbers are probably about 25,000 children were killed. Since October 7th, in 2008-9, Operation Cast Lead was about 350 children. Operation Protective Edge, it was about 550 children. Right now, since October 7th, the number of housing units destroyed is something on the order, if my memory is correct, something on the order of 300,000. During Operation Cast Lead, it was 6,000. During Operation Protective Edge, it was 18,000. And so on down the line. So, you had the concentration camp-like conditions. You had the high-tech killing spree of an overwhelmingly refugee population. Now, when Hamas came to power in January 2006, in what was uniformly described as fair and free elections, it didn't come to power on some sort of radical Islamic platform. It ran on a platform, a relatively modest platform. It was reform. The Palestinian Authority was hopelessly corrupt, and combined with the corruption, it was hopelessly inept. And Hamas had a reputation of being honest in its conduct of civil affairs. It was honest. It ran a large number of charitable organizations in Gaza, and had a very positive reputation. There's a good book by the Harvard scholar Sarah Roy on Hamas during those years, the 80s, the 90s. And she describes, as I said, a pretty honest and also competent organization. The members of Hamas, or the leadership, I should say, the leadership was highly educated. Now, education is not everything. Obviously, you want something more from a politician than he or she is educated. But for there to be a competent leadership, education counts for something. I've only had relatively little contact with Hamas as an organization. I met its leader, I believe in 2003 at the time, Dr. Rantisi. Now, for those of you who think it's wild he met a leader, actually it was no wild at all. He lived very modestly in a simple home in Gaza, and it was clear he was going to be assassinated, because as you have been assassinating leaders of Gaza for many years, over a long period. So, but he was a highly regarded, my memory is he was a pediatrician, and he was a highly regarded pediatrician in Gaza. And then recently, over the last, time flies, so it's now over the last decade or so, I got to know their chief international representative, a person named Bassem Naim, and he seemed a decent enough fellow. And then I later discovered, by happenstance, that he has 2 PhDs in Germany. He has a medical degree and a civil engineering degree. And he was the head of Gaza's Ministry of Health. And getting 2 PhDs in Germany is not small change. it's an achievement. So I actually had a conversation with him over the phone, maybe a year ago. I said to him, you know, I didn't know you had 2 PhDs in Germany. I said, you know, you didn't deserve this fate. And he then proceeded to say that since October 2nd, his son was killed, his mother was killed, and he started just going through the whole list of people that were killed, which was unusual because there's never any self-pity on display. And maybe he was just trying to be factual and not trying to evoke pity. In any event, they had a reputation for competence and honesty, and their platform was reform. And actually, they did later modify their platform. In any event, they recognize that you have to deliver. You're elected into office, you have to deliver. And in order to deliver in Gaza, the first order of business had to be getting the blockade lifted. Everything else is really an afterthought because of how crippling that blockade was. And Hamas did attempt at first to use diplomacy to try to modify the blockade, to lift the blockade, or at least diminish the blockade. And it did all sorts of things. It offered a peaceful settlement of the conflict based on 2 states. You could say that their formulations were not perfect, but they were certainly something that you could work with if you wanted peace. Secondly, they offered a long-term ceasefire. So I think sometimes it was said 8 years, sometimes it was said 20 years. What the Arabic, anyone here speak Arabic? So the Arabic word is a hudna, a long-term ceasefire. But none of their offers received any response. And then Hamas decided, it might sound surprising, but Hamas tried international law. What does that mean? It meant in practice, after each of Israel's high-tech killing sprees in Gaza, it was typical that human rights organizations, the UN Human Rights Council, they would send delegations to Israel and Gaza in order to investigate whether or not there were violations, breaches of international law. Each time Israel, per usual, refused to cooperate. It didn't just refuse to cooperate with the UN Human Rights Council, it refused to cooperate with Amnesty International, it refused to cooperate with Human Rights Watch. That was not surprising. What was surprising was, in my opinion, it was a surprise, Hamas decided to cooperate. It welcomed each time all the delegations. Now, you might think, well, of course they welcomed it because they knew that these organizations are anti-Israel and will find in support of the people of Gaza. But it's just not true. The human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they have always been very unsympathetic when it came to Gaza. You can ask me why, and I'm happy during questions and answers to try to explore that question. But there was no doubt from the get-go that these organizations would treat Hamas harshly. And in fact, when you look at the final reports in each of those instances, cast lead, protective edge, and so forth, they were very critical of Gaza. They were very critical of Hamas. But on the other hand, Hamas figured they've got to find something against Israel because the crimes were of such a magnitude. And so they were willing to take the chance. They knew that they would be condemned. However, they still wanted to get on record what Israel had done. And so they repeatedly cooperated with the human rights community and the UN Human Rights Organization. They repeatedly cooperated. The bottom line, however, was we got nothing from the cooperation. The reports were produced in some cases, not all. In some cases, the reports were very professional and they were devastating to Israel. Obviously, they had to be less devastating to Hamas simply because of the objective facts. If you take Operation Cast Lead, it was one child killed by Hamas rockets in Israel, one, versus 350 Gazan children killed. One home was destroyed in Israel versus 6,000 homes destroyed in Gaza. So it had to turn out that the reports were going to be much more critical of Israel than Hamas. As I said, Hamas accepted that verdict, but nothing came of the reports. You have very extensive dossiers filled with, replete with documentation. Some of them run into 200-300 pages, single space. And they reach their conclusions. We take the case of the most famous of the reports, the Goldstone report. It reaches the conclusion that Israel was guilty of war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. All for what? The reports are forwarded to the relevant bodies in the UN and through all sorts of machination and cowardice. They're just placed in a drawer to collect dust. Well, after their diplomatic offers failed, after their attempt to cooperate on the basis of international law failed, Hamas then supported nonviolent civil resistance in Gaza, what was called the Great March of Return. It began on March 30th, 2018. And what happened next? We have another UN report to tell us. The UN report was very exhaustive. It ran to 250 pages, single space, and it dotted every I and crossed every T. It was a very exhaustive report. What did it find? It found that Israel it found that Hamas demonstrations, protests, they were all overwhelmingly nonviolent. We're talking about the period roughly Mark, well, according to that UN report, they targeted children, they targeted medics or medical personnel, they targeted journalists, and they targeted disabled people, for example, double amputees. It targeted them largely, or I should say totally, when they were nowhere even near the perimeter fence. In each case that they described in the report, they locate exactly where the person was when he or she was shot. And it was always between 100 and 300 meters away from the perimeter fence with Israel. On May 14th, there was a major Israeli massacre, and then the nonviolent aspect of the demonstrations began to diminish, inevitably, I would say. The report goes up until October, and it still shows that Israel is repeatedly targeting, without justification, demonstrators. So, bottom line is, I believe, had I the time to go through this record with Mr. Morgan, had I the time, I would say the bottom line is you have an overwhelmingly refugee population immured, incarcerated in a concentration camp under a medieval siege, medieval criminal siege, because it's a form of collective punishment, that the people of Gaza, its leadership, but also the people, because the nonviolent March of Return was a mass undertaking. They tried everything available to try to reach some sort of, the expression is modus vivendi, which is just a fancy Latin term for a way to live together. They tried to find a way to live together, and there was no satisfying Israel on this score. Israel was only going to accept abject defeat, total capitulation. By October 6, 2023, the situation in Gaza was certainly of those who burst the gates of Gaza concentration camp, they had been born into it. They had languished in it. And they were fated to die in it. It's often forgotten now that by 2023, Gaza had vanished from the news. It was no longer a subject of political interest. It was no longer newsworthy. What was happening at that point was the big question whether Saudi Arabia was going to join in what was called the Abraham Accords, for there to be an open alliance between the US, Israel, and the Arab states, and Gaza was destined to be forgotten. To ask the question, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th, is as disconnected a question as to ask in 1831, do you condemn the Nat Turner Rebellion? Nat Turner was the largest revolt in American history against slavery. It was a very bloody affair, for sure. Mr. Turner gave the order to his fellow insurrectionists. He gave the order, quote, kill all white people. And for about a day and a half, almost exactly the same amount of time as October 7th, for about a day and a half, they proceeded on a rampage and killed every white person in sight. Children, women, smashed skulls, outright committed murder. Now, to ask the question, do you, let's say it's Pierce Morgan, and he has an abolitionist, those who oppose slavery, Charles Sumner, William Lloyd Garrison, a lot of very impressive folks back then. Thaddeus Stevens. If Pierce Morgan asked one of them the question, do you condemn Nat Turner, without mentioning that he was a slave, without mentioning that he was born into slavery, was destined to languish in slavery, and to die in slavery, anybody would recognize that's a completely crazy question if you don't mention that he's a slave, that he was a slave. The question, stripped of its context, is a preposterous question. Now, at least back then, everybody understood that Nat Turner was a slave. At least that was visible and comprehensible. But in the case of Gaza, how many people knew the prehistory of Gaza? How many people knew? How many viewers of Pierce Morgan's program? Now, you know, in the case of Nat Turner was a religious zealot, for sure. He interpreted his experience in terms of the Bible and religion. And it is true that those defending the institution of slavery, it is true that they said he did everything he did because he was a religious zealot. He was a nut. They said he was a fanatic. But apart from those within the slave system, everybody understood that that was not an adequate explanation, that you can't explain Nat Turner's actions without mentioning slavery. But the attempts from October 7th onwards to try to limit discussion to October 7th onwards was a systematic attempt to rig the conversation in a manner akin to rigging a conversation about Nat Turner without mentioning that he was a slave. Having said that, I believe a legitimate question that should have been put was not, do you condemn Hamas for October 7th? I think the legitimate question would be, were the people of Gaza obliged to accept their fate of being born into languishing and dying in a concentration camp? Were the people of Gaza obliged to accept their fate of being born into languishing and dying in a concentration camp? Had the question been put that way, I think the response would have not been so clearly an emphatic yes, as those who appeared in Piers Morgan emphatically agreed to condemn Hamas. In fact, virtually everybody agreed because they understood those were the limits of legitimate discussions. So people like Mehdi Hassan and Cenk Uygur and all the others, Anna Kasparian. In the case of the latter two, Mr. Uygur and Ms. Kasparian, for those of you who know them, their collective IQ hovers in the range of a walnut. In any event, I think that way of posing the question was wholly dishonest, and the success of that question depended on people not knowing the real history that was the backdrop to October 7th. I would say from October 7th forward, the biggest myth about the situation in Gaza, the biggest myth was that what unfolded in Gaza was a war. There was no war in Gaza. What was it? Well, I believe eventually a consensus crystallized. It was a genocide. Now, many of you will be thinking, well, is there a big difference between describing it as a war versus describing it as a genocide? And I do believe there is a big difference, and I will try in the next few minutes to try to demonstrate to you. It will require a certain amount of concentration, but I think you can get the rough outlines of what I want to say. So let's begin with a question from an illustrious audience. We will call this audience the Mensa of Little Rock. Everyone know what Mensa is? Okay. It's the high IQ side of the spectrum. So, we'll begin with some simple questions. Number one, what is a war? What is a war? Or let's put it differently. What is the object of a war? Each side, what are they trying to do in the war? Anyone want to attempt an answer? Good, your name?
Karen?
Karen?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Competing for land or resources.
Okay, that would be the, what's the object of the actual war? What are you trying to do?
Win.
Excuse me?
To win.
Good. And how do you win a war?
By defeating the opposing force.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. I think if you combine all three of you, you get one Mensa membership. Yes, the object of a war is to defeat the enemy's army. In a battlefield, that's not what you're saying is the ultimate goal. Yes, I agree. There's some ultimate goal. But on the battlefield, the object of a war is to defeat the enemy's army. That's pretty straightforward, correct?
Yes.
So you could say World War II is a little bit complicated. I think World War I is less complicated. You could say in World War I, each of the sides, each of the alliances, they sought to inflict a military defeat on the other side. That's straightforward. Now, since the mid-19th century, there has developed this body of international law called the laws of war. The technical term is international humanitarian law, and sometimes it's abbreviated IHL. We'll just call it the laws of war. And the laws of war have a very straightforward goal. I'm going to just read to you from the founding, what's considered one of the founding documents, namely the St. Petersburg Declaration of 1857. And it says, the purpose of this declaration is to try to alleviate the calamities of war. How do you make war less destructive? That's the goal of the laws of war. To develop a body of law that will make war less destructive. And the foundation of the laws of war, the foundation is a huge body of law. But the foundation is a very simple principle, which everybody in this room knows, not just because you are high IQ, but even if you were low IQ, you would know it. It's a very simple, basic principle. The technical term is the principle of distinction. Who can tell the assembled people here, what is that basic principle of laws of war? What is that basic principle? Technically, it's called the principle of distinction, but everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. What is the basic principle? Yes?
Is that distinguishing between a civilian and someone who's like a part of the military?
Yes. The basic principle of the laws of war on which everything else is built, the edifice of the laws of war, is built on one simple principle, that you can target combatants and military objects, tanks, anti-aircraft weapons. You can target combatants and military objects, but you can't target civilians and civilian objects. Civilian objects would be homes, schools, hospitals. You can't target them. So the laws of war, or I should say, war is regulated by laws. And those laws have as their basic or foundational principle the principle of distinction between military and civilian objects, between combatants and civilians. Now that we've established that, what is a genocide? We've agreed a war is when you try to inflict a military defeat on your adversary. What's a genocide?
Destruction of a people.
Genocide is the destruction of a people. It's not just to target the enemy army, but on the contrary, it's to exterminate the entire enemy population. That's something very different. It's the opposite of war. In war, you're supposed to limit yourself according to the laws of war. You're limiting yourself to combatants and military objects. In a genocide, you're targeting the entire civilian population and civilian objects, civilian infrastructure. The goal of a war is the opposite of the goal of a genocide. The goal of a genocide is the opposite of the goal of a war. But here's another thing. It's in the nature of a genocide that you can't obey the laws of war. If you were to obey the principle of distinction, namely not targeting civilians, if you were to obey the laws of war, you couldn't carry out a genocide. So it's the nature of a genocide that you can't obey the laws of war. It's something altogether different. Now, having said that, what are the practical consequences of that distinction? Under the laws of war, the killing of civilians is illegitimate, but the killing of combatants is legitimate. But here's the thing. In a genocide, it can't be legitimate to kill combatants. Or you might say, why is that the case? In a genocide, you're not allowed to, it's not legitimate to kill combatants. Why? Well, here's the reason why. Because you're not killing them because they're combatants. Why are you killing them? In a genocide, if you're targeting a population, why are you killing the combatants? Are you killing them because they're combatants? Why are you killing them?
They're of that population.
Say it again.
They are of that population.
They're of that population. You're killing them because you're targeting a whole group of people. It can't be legitimate to kill a person just because he or she belongs to a particular group. That's why, we don't have it here in front of us, but that's why the Genocide Convention, 1948 Genocide Convention, it defines genocide as when you are targeting a part or whole of a particular racial, ethnic, religious, or national group. It doesn't say racial civilians of a particular racial, ethnic, national, religious group. No. In a genocide, even the killing of combatants is illegal because you're not targeting them because they're combatants. You're targeting them because they belong to a particular group. So what does that mean to get back to Gaza? let's take an example. So during the Israeli assault on Gaza, very frequently they targeted homes, schools, hospitals, because they claimed that Hamas was using them. Hamas was located in them. Hamas militants were located in them. So it was said the building was targeted because Hamas terrorists were in it. The building was targeted because Hamas terrorists were in it. And that seemed to be a reasonable explanation, because under the laws of war, they were legitimate targets. However, this was a genocide. They weren't being targeted because they were Hamas militants. They were being targeted for the same reason that any other civilians were being targeted. They were being targeted because they were Palestinian. That can't be legitimate. The laws of war, yes, under the law, if it were a war, they would be legitimate targets. But it wasn't a war. It was a genocide. And in a genocide, they can't be counted as legitimate targets. Take a typical case. Let's leave aside the one I gave. So, Israel's engaged in a genocide. It's indiscriminately bombing huge swaths of land. And then it's discovered, let's say they killed 500 people. And it's discovered 100 of those 500 persons killed, 100, it's discovered they belong to Hamas. So under the laws of war, it's correct to say that Israel killed 400 civilians and 100 combatants. That's technically correct. But if it were a genocide, no such distinction is made. Nobody counts in a genocide. Use your own recollections. In Srebrenica, in Rwanda, during the Nazi Holocaust, did anyone calculate what percentage of the Srebrenicans, the Rwandans, the Jews, did anybody calculate what percentage were combatants? Ask yourself a simple question. Did that question even arise? Did anybody even pose the question, well, of the 6 million Jews who were killed, shouldn't we be subtracting the number who were engaged in combat? Does that question ever even arise? Of course not. For the simple reason that in a genocide, the perpetrators of it aren't distinguishing on the basis of whether or not you're a combatant. They're distinguishing on the basis of whether or not you belong to a particular targeted group, racial, ethnic, etc. group. And so my own view is all of the sorts of propaganda during the events after October 7th, trying to discern whether or not there was a Hamas militant in the building, whether those killed were Hamas militants. I think it was a total, as the expression has it, a red herring. That wasn't the issue. Of distinctions, the distinctions of the laws of war become irrelevant. The distinction between legitimate civilian killings and, I should say, the distinction between illegitimate civilian killings and legitimate combat killings or combatant killings, it makes no sense in a genocide. In a genocide, every death is illegitimate. Every killing is illegitimate. The whole purpose of the laws of war, the whole purpose of it, was, to use the expression, to quote, alleviating the calamities of war. But in a genocide, it's impossible to make a genocide less destructive. It's in the nature of a genocide that you cannot alleviate the calamities of it. The calamity of a genocide is built into a genocide. It's meant to be calamitous to soldier and civilian alike. That's its purpose. Its objective is total destruction. Every aspect of a genocide, its goal, wiped out a population, its mode of carrying out its goal, killing everybody, civilians, combatants, combatants and civilians. Every aspect of a genocide is illegitimate. Every aspect of it is illegitimate, including the killing of combatants. That's how I see it. You can ponder it in your head, and maybe you'll come to a different conclusion. You might want to argue, and I think it's legitimate, you might want to argue, well, but when they're targeting Hamas militants in a hospital, aren't they at that point engaging in a war and not a genocide? Everybody understand my point? That can't you make the argument that at the point that they're targeting Hamas militants in a hospital or Hamas militants on the battlefield, they're targeting them as if in a war, not a genocide. So it makes it a little bit more complicated, and I recognize that. My answer would be, I think they're targeting them for both reasons. They're targeting them because they're combatants, but they're also targeting them for the same reason they're targeting every other man, woman, and child in Gaza, because they're Palestinians. And I would simply say, to the point that they're targeting them because they're members of a group, a national group in this case, and an ethnic group in this case, to that extent, it's illegitimate. And I believe the record will show that overwhelmingly, that's what happened in Gaza. There were no battles in Gaza. We're 2.5 years outside the beginning. Can anyone name a single battle? During most periods, do you know how many Israeli soldiers were killed? 1 per 2 to 3 days. 1 per 2 to 3 days. On the Palestinian side, it was about, my memory is about 230 every day, 230 every day, versus 1 every 2 to 3 days. And then you have to use your own judgment. Does that sound like a war? Or does that sound like a genocide? You know, you have to, as I say, judge it for yourself. There's a third topic I want to look at, and I would say, without trying to be melodramatic about it, I would say the end of the current round, which effectively ended November 17th, 2025, with the UN Security Council resolution. That resolution, it marked the provisional end of the conflict, but it also marked, I believe, the end of the United Nations as a legitimate international organ. I know many people make grandiose statements like that, but in this case, I do believe it's warranted. And let me try to briefly explain why. The Israel-Palestine conflict, it was originally Israel-Palestine and Israel-Arab, and then became again Israel-Palestine. It obviously has a very long history. For our purposes, for the purposes of the modern period, it goes back to the 1947 UN partition resolution dividing British Mandate Palestine into 2 states. That was the major UN intervention, and we're pretty much at the founding of the United Nations. And then after 1967, there was a very significant involvement of the UN in the United Nations, in the Israel, at that point it was Israel-Arab, but then it became Israel-Arab and Israel-Palestinian conflict. And this huge body of law was created in the course of the period from 1967 to the present. Most of you will be familiar with aspects of that law. For example, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. That meant, in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, Israel acquired the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza in the course of a war. Under international law, Israel had no title to any of the West Bank, any of East Jerusalem, and any of Gaza, because it had acquired them in the course of a war. So if you look at UN Resolution 242, basically the foundational resolution for the modern period, it has a preambular paragraph. Preambular paragraph just means the preamble to the resolution. And one of the statements in the preamble is, given that it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. So, and then over the period from 1967 to the present, the United Nations developed all sorts of other principles based on international law. So, for example, the Palestinians constitute a people. If they constitute a people, then they have the right to self-determination. Where do they have the right to self-determination? The UN resolved they have the right to self-determination up to and including a state. Self-determination can take many forms. For example, Quebec has self-determination within the context of the Canadian state. Self-determination doesn't necessarily take the form of an independent state. Greenland exercises its self-determination within the political entity called the Kingdom of Denmark. So peoples can have a right to self-determination, not necessarily in the form of a state, it can take other forms. In the case of Palestine, the UN made clear on more occasions than there are seats in this room, many more occasions than there are seats in this room, that the Palestinians have a right to self-determination. The Palestinian people have a right to self-determination in the what were called the occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. And then finally, the UN ruled, it was, if my memory is correct, it was in July 2005, the UN ruled finally, after a very long period of time, it ruled that the occupation of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, was illegal under international law. Now, obviously, that does not exhaust the record. There were the UN rulings, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the International Court of Justice. There was the ruling that the settlements Israel has built in the occupied West Bank are illegal under international law. I'm just limiting myself to the key findings for our purposes. One, inadmissible to acquire territory by war, from which it follows. Two, Israel has no title to one jot, one tittle of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, or title to any jot or tittle of Gaza. Three, the Palestinians are our people. As a people, they're entitled to the right to self-determination, up to and including a state. And finally, most recently, the International Court of Justice ruled that Israel's occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem are illegal, and Israel must withdraw, the phrase they use is, as rapidly as possible. That is the law. It's a law that has accumulated, you could say, beginning in 1948, and then with much more intensity after 1967. So you could say the founding resolution is the partition resolution of 1947, or you could say it's UN Resolution 242 of 1967. But whether it's 47 or 67, we're talking about a very sustained period of time, and we're talking about intense activity by the United Nations. Intense activity. Well, what happened on November 17, 2025? What happened? The Security Council meets and it passes a resolution. Now, in typical UN resolutions in Israel and Gaza, and you can check for yourself, you can randomly look up any resolution. It typically begins with about 5 pages, simply reciting all the relevant international law, all the relevant resolutions. Everything that I just told you, it appears in the preambular paragraphs to every resolution. Absolutely standard. It starts with emphasizing that, reiterating that, recognizing that, underlining that. It goes through all the principles. Something strange happened on the way to UN Resolution 2803. All of the law vanished. There's no preambular paragraphs. That whole body of law that stretches back to 1947, it all was whited out in the UN resolution. If you look at the resolution, Gaza has no legal status. A typical UN resolution would define the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, as occupied Palestinian territories, designated for self-determination. In this resolution, Gaza is suspended in legal thin air. It never defines what Gaza is. It's just, there was a technical term during the conquest of Africa, beginning in the late 19th century. And there had to be a legal justification for the conquest of Africa. And the legal justification was res nullius. Any of our Mensa members know what res nullius is? It means belonging to no one. And the claim was Africa belonged to no one. And that was the legal justification for its carving up by the European powers. And now, Gaza became a res nullius. It didn't belong to anyone. It didn't belong to its population. It wasn't part of the occupied Palestinian territories. It didn't have any rights. It was res nullius. It belonged to nobody. Now, I know this will be hard to believe, but I can assure you, even though I, being human, I have that penchant for exaggeration that everybody has, I do try when I write or speak to be very faithful to the facts. You know what the resolution did? It gave Donald J. Trump liberty. It gave Donald J. Trump the deed to Gaza. Now you say that can't be. That cannot be. But you know what? It is. It created what it called, it's been very widely used the past week, it created what it called a board of peace in Gaza. And the board of peace is the presiding political body in Gaza. And it annexed to the resolution the Donald Trump peace plan, which of course he never read, but all he cared about was that his name was attached to it. He got, and the 20-point peace plan said Donald Trump will be the chairman of the board of peace. It says it literally. And if there was any doubt, after the vote on the resolution, the U.S. representative stated, Donald Trump is the head of the Board of Peace, to leave no ambiguity, no equivocation. But then you might say, but wait a minute, the UN designated him the head in the resolution, so the UN must be in charge of him. Doesn't that make sense? No, that's not true. If you look at the resolution, the UN Security Council, all it did was, it, quote, requests, not demands, not insists, requests that the Board of Peace every 6 months submit to the Security Council an updated report. That's it. There was no external control. He got Gaza. I know you. That can't be this. Now, you know, today he named 20 members of his Board of Peace. But here's the thing. He chose them. He chose the board. It's not like there is an executive body or legislative body controlling his power. There's none. There are no internal constraints. None. None. Is there a constitution or to this Board of Peace that says there's X, Y, and Z limit on his power? No, there's none. Is there any external control, say by the Security Council? Absolutely none. Nothing. It simply says the question is the resolution will be revisited in 2027, 2 years. 2 years, he can do whatever he wants. It's just another property, another deed, literally, in the Trump organization. If they want to, no, it's absolutely true. If they want to build hotels, if they want to do what he said to the Mediterranean, the Riviera, they can do whatever he wants. That's what the UN did. That's what the Security Council did. What happened to that right of self-determination of the Palestinians? It said, am I a problem with time?
No. You just say that it happened literally today.
Yeah, the Board of Peace was today.
Yeah, today.
What happened to the right of self-determination? Well, here's what happened. It said that before we discuss the future of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, the executive body of the total Palestinian population there, they have to reform. They have to reform. How are they supposed to reform? Are there benchmarks that say you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do nothing? So, how do you know when they're reformed? There's no way of knowing. But let's say, for the sake of argument, it meets some unknown standard of reform. It then says, when the Palestinian Authority reforms, here are the words, it may open a pathway to resolving the conflict. It may. It may not. The Palestinian Authority may meet the benchmarks, but we don't know what they are, so it may not. But even if they meet the benchmarks, it still would not mean more than it may open a pathway, which means even if they meet the benchmarks, it may not. But it doesn't mean it may result in the self-determination. It said it may open a pathway to resolving the conflict. And a pathway to what? The next sentence says there has to be negotiations and they have to agree to the result. So if Israel doesn't agree to a state, there can't be a state. The whole legal framework, in one fell swoop, was abolished in the UN resolution. People were shocked. Mr. Trump invaded Venezuela. He said, I want Venezuela. And then he proceeded to take it. Why should anyone be shocked? The UN gave him Gaza. So he decided, well, no, just take Venezuela also. Why not? They gave me Gaza. They gave me Gaza. Why shouldn't he take Greenland? No, really, why shouldn't he? You gave him Gaza? Too bad. You lost Greenland. I have no sympathy whatsoever, none. You think you can treat that way, treat the people of Gaza that way, but you're not going to be treated that way? Why? Why? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Treat Gaza that way, take Greenland as far as I'm concerned. No, it's not Greenland. And the big debate in the news this afternoon was, did he win or didn't he win? That's not whether it was illegal or not whether it was moral or not. It's just whether he won or not. That was the only relevant question. As a footnote, as some of you know, 2 countries abstained in the vote in the United Nations Security Council. It's 13-2. The 2 were Russia and China. And it was interesting why they abstained. Russia said, no, this is a terrible resolution. They said it's a black day in the history of the United Nations. In fact, it said at the end of its statement, it said, this is a disaster. And its very last sentence was, quote, don't say we didn't warn you. Don't say we didn't warn you. Well, if that was the opinion of the Russians, it was essentially the opinion of the Chinese, then why did they abstain? Why did they veto it? Why did they veto it? And actually, they had a problem. You know what the problem was? All the Arab and Muslim states supported the U.S. Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, Algeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. They all support the resolution. And so the Russians said we did. Oh, I left out the most important. The Palestinian Authority welcomed the resolution. So the Russians and the Chinese said, if they all support it, how can we not support it? It's politically untenable. The betrayal of all, the entire Arab Muslim world. They sold out the people of Gaza. So, I think there were significant consequences of what happened beginning in 2023. I've looked at what I would call some of the lessons and some of the legacies of what happened. I think the most important lesson is you can't understand what happened on October 7th unless you understand what led up to it. The most important lesson for after October 7th was it was not a war, it was a genocide. And totally different rules apply in a genocide. And the third is Chile opposed the U.S. action, but it condemned Maduro. that he was an illegitimate head of state, the election was rigged. Fine, I can see that argument. Many states refused to recognize the last election in Venezuela. But to condemn Maduro by name, and you can show the most minimum backbone to condemn the attack on Venezuela's sovereignty. It was so pitiful. Such a pitiful sight. And I think that we simply have to give up any expectation that the UN can henceforth serve as a legitimate body for arbitrary conflict. I'm perfectly aware how uneven its record has been. But even acknowledging its record has been uneven, it remains true, I believe, that after November 17th, 2025, the UN turned into a rotting corpse. There's nothing there anymore. Okay, thank you.
So Hamid had asked me the questions through Deborah Winger before. I don't know if he has other questions for you or not, but if anybody has a question, I can take the mic to you. Thank you. Thanks for being here. I'm so shocked that you're here for 3 days.
No, the snow is
that's fine.
I think the snow is just one more science block.
One.
But my question was the current development of Iran situation and how the West is trying to influence and has been trying to influence the outcome, of course, with the help of Israel. What is your assessment of that situation? No, I will add one more thing, because when you're talking about Palestinian situation, I think we need to remind ourselves that under this climate, as you kind of pictured for us, that our UN is no more because of all this lack of backbone of all these nations and individuals. So Iran is in a very peculiar place. And what is your assessment in that?
I think there are many orders of business as we press forward. I think the main order of business has to begin with the recognition that there is no possibility whatsoever of working within established institutions. They have both at the domestic American level and at the international level, they're proven to be totally bankrupt. There's nothing left to hope for from those institutions. And I think this past experience has been very revealing. We've now had 3 consecutive presidencies. One by the first from 2016 to 2020 by Mr. Trump, 20 to 24 by Mr. Biden, and then 24 until God knows when, Mr. Trump again. when the first Trump election happened, it was perfectly reasonable to dismiss it as an aberration and as a fluke. And many people did say it was an aberration and a fluke. But then we elected somebody president who, for a significant period of his term of office, was, for all intents and purposes, brain dead. And that was covered up by his party. And then we elected again what we thought what it was said to be an aberration and a fluke in 2016. I think the only reasonable conclusion is there's some real rot at the heart of this system. Otherwise, how could it have happened for 3 consecutive presidential elections? And I'll give you an example at the international level. In 1967, Israel launches what is called a preemptive attack in June 1967. When Israel launched the attack, there was a huge debate, which continues to this day. Nearly 60 years later now. 50 or 60? 67? 50. It continues to this day as to whether Israel had a legal right to attack in self-defense. Because Israel was claiming that the head of President Nasser of Egypt was going to attack Israel, so they launched a preemptive attack. And there's a whole huge body of scholarly and legal literature. Did Israel have the right to attack in 1967? But in recent years, when the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran, was there any debate? There was nothing. What does that tell you? It means that whole body of law, starting with the Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. It's all gone. It's not even, nobody even discusses whether the US and Israel had a legal right to attack. When the debate happened over, when Trump attacked Venezuela, not only was there no debate, it was actually not considered illegitimate to say, well, we needed the oil. You could say that. Believe me, you could not say that 50 years ago. It would be impossible. Impossible. The fact that that could be said, and that it was not the object of outrage. When you looked at Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, when he had the comment on Venezuela, his response was, well, there are no guardrails as to how we're going forward. That was the problem. No guardrails going forward. Not that it was illegal. Not that it was completely outrageous. Yes, Venezuela or Greenland. In the case of Greenland, we need it because it's a national security threat. Okay. Then why aren't we attacking China? China is both a national security threat and it has the rare minerals. We need the rare minerals. Why are we attacking China? Why are we attacking anyone? Potentially could be a threat. That's just a carte blanche to attack every country in the world. But today I'm listening to people like this guy, Scott Spicer, the former press secretary for Trump. Is it Scott Spicer? Is it Sean Spicer? And he's saying that it's good for national security, and I gotta say, we need this and need that, as if a need entitles you to take another people's country. The discourse has become so debased. It's actually pre the League of Nations. The way these things are now being discussed openly. You could say what you want. I mean, there's no way on God's earth that Lyndon B. Johnson would say, we attack Vietnam because we need their tungsten. He did have some stuff. You couldn't say that. You couldn't say it. And now that's become legitimate. Canada just signed a strategic partnership with China. Does that mean we can attack Canada? No, really. The logic is breathtaking when you carry it through. And the fact that all that has been legitimized, I think, is those institutions are now completely bankrupt. There's nothing left. Good.
Given your, I take it, accurate assessment that institutional integrity has become non-existent, what is the rationale for any person in this society to believe that there can somehow be a just resolution to our current situation through the so-called constitutional mechanisms that we have extolled across the history of the society?
I believe there are two things to be said. There are a smattering of young people here. The first thing I believe is that we have to begin serious work of creating an alternative institution. I believe now is the right time for young people to begin a serious discussion about creating an alternative United Nations for future generations. I think the UN has to be replaced now, or at least on the world stage. There has to be a competing body. Obviously, any one day can say that, but I believe there is a real possibility now for attempting it to create an alternative representative organization made up predominantly, overwhelmingly, of people, young people under 40. A United Nations of future generations on the very obvious pretext or grounds that there are problems facing humankind which simply are not being addressed any longer in any kind of persuasive or serious way by existing institutions. So I would hope there'll be serious discussion of that. And then at the domestic level, I think the real challenge is There was a famous slogan during the Vietnam War era. I think it was coined by Che Guevara, the Cuban revolutionary, but I could be wrong on that. It was during, as I said, the war in Vietnam, and it was 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams. That to defeat Western imperialism, as it was called, we need 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams. And right now, on a more humble note, I think we need 1, 2, 3, many Mamdanis. We need domestic local domestic organization to tap the mass discontent with the system as it's currently constituted around slogans that will resonate for the local communities, and to try to start building from the bottom up, again, an alternative institutional power. And I believe it has to be done now, because moments pass. Right now, Mamdani was able to build a movement around the principles of affordability and support for Gaza. Now, Gaza is probably going to vanish again within a few months, because we had Venezuela, then we had Greenland, and it looks like it's over with Greenland for now. But then there's going to be Mexico, and there's going to be Colombia, and there's going to be, and going to be, and going to be. And Gaza will recede into an infinite vacuum, the memory hole. Regress into an infinite vacuum, the memory hole. But right now, there's a possibility of building local institutions which are representative of the overwhelming majority of the people. So I think that is, for the moment, the direction we should go. And then there are two specific issues. There is two burning specific issues. There's the issue of ICE, and there's the issue of freedom of speech. Those are not trivial issues. I think everybody understands that. On the question of ICE, I think we have a very strong precedent. A very strong precedent in American history. One that's been very striking to me to observe, which is in 1850, pre-Civil War, in 1850, the U.S. Congress, it passes the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act basically meant if a runaway slave comes to the North, it was the opinion of the northern states that that runaway slave automatically becomes a citizen, because the northern states have abolished slavery. So the moment you step from South Carolina, you step into Massachusetts, you should automatically become a citizen. Our Congress decided against that. It decided as a national policy, standing above state law, that as a national policy, a slave, if he or she runs away, that what were called slave catchers or slave hunters were allowed to come in and retrieve the slave back into slavery. So the abolitionists, the opponents of slavery, when they abolished slavery, they were obviously, or predictably, they were outraged by this Fugitive Slave Act. And they spoke very eloquently on it. Very impressive characters. And they fought hard against those slave hunters. They were called They're called bloodhounds. I like the expression by Frederick Douglass, the best known of the African American abolitionists. He called the slave hunters biped, B-I-P-E-D, biped bloodhounds. And they gave those slave hunters a hard time. They gave them a very hard time. They organized, they were called vigilance committees. They organized in every city in the north vigilance committees, and the vigilance committees tracked those slave hunters, those biped bloodhounds. And in an informal way, I don't think necessarily, probably not informed by history, the people of Minneapolis are doing the same thing. Very impressive to watch. I've not yet been there, I hope to be. But to see, they're all white. If you watch the videos, they're all white. And you know what? They're overwhelmingly women. It's a very striking thing. And they are risking their lives. You know, I see these folks, and they go right up to the face of these ICE people and say, "You're a Nazi. You're a Nazi." Now, unfortunately, for most of the people hearing that, it's not an epithet, but a source of pride. But it takes real courage, and you know, they're doing it in the midst of a very cold winter there, and amid the snow. It's very reminiscent, if you read the stories, it's very reminiscent of the vigilance committees fighting against the Fugitive Slave Act. So I think trying to reach people, it's very useful to invoke that precedent of what the people in our country did back then. They're the same thing. For those of you there's nobody here from my generation, but if you go back far enough, you know what this is? What's going on in Minneapolis and elsewhere? I swear to God. It's invasion of the body snatchers.
Right.
There's a famous movie from the 1950s, a science fiction. It's the invasion of the body snatchers. These people are invading communities and snatching bodies. So you can go back to the Fugitive Slave Act, or you can go back to the 1950s famous. It's the same thing. So I think that studying that history, it's both inspiring and it's useful for Americans to make that connection. These ICE people are the modern day slave hunters. They're the modern day biped bloodhounds. Biped bloodhounds. And the last thing, I think the great battle, it gets worse and worse. It's the complete and total capitulation on freedom of speech. I don't think anybody has a clue anymore what our country's history is on free speech. I was just listening today to this woman in Miami who wrote this utterly innocuous post about the mayor of Miami, who sounds like a freak. And there was just nothing in it. And she got a knock on the door from the police. I have to say, I'm not naive, but this one shocked me. There's been a complete capitulation. You know, they said, from the river to the sea, it has to be banned, anti-Semitic, anti-this, anti-that. You know, in my day, during the war in Vietnam, a significant number of the demonstrators, a significant number, during the war in Vietnam, we chanted, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win. NLF was the National Liberation Front fighting the Americans in South Vietnam. We were chanting for the enemy to win. That's like treason. But guess what? It's protected speech. And the whole time that I attended those demonstrations, it never even occurred to anyone. It was not even a fleeting thought that that was illegal. It wasn't even an issue. Of course you had the right to chant that in our country. In our country, the Communist Party was and is legal. The Communist Party advocates the violent overthrow of the government. That's legal. In that era, I belonged to a Maoist group, followers of Chairman Mao in China. Don't ask me to explain it, you're too young to understand. But the point is this. For us, it was a point of principle to advocate the violent overthrow of the government because we didn't believe democratic institutions could work. Actually, we were right about that. We advocated the violent overthrow of the government. Now, here's the deal. When I went home from work, I belonged to a Maoist newspaper. When I went home from work, I never thought I'd be arrested for that. It was just obviously protected by our Constitution, our Supreme Court law. In our country, brace yourself, it's illegal to burn the American flag. That case went before the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice of the court at the time was a fellow named Rehnquist. And Rehnquist wrote a very eloquent dissent. He talked about how much the flag meant to him, how the Americans raising the flag in Iwo Jima, it brought tears to his eyes. He then devoted a good page and a half of his dissent to reproducing, replicating a tone on the American flag. And I'm sure it was true. He felt deeply about the flag, okay? But the majority ruled that the flag, burning a flag is what's called a form of symbolic speech or expressive conduct. You're trying to express something through your conduct. And since you're trying to express something, or the flag was a symbol, was a symbolic form of speech, it was protected. And that entire Supreme Court history has been completely forgotten. It's been erased. And the biggest battleground, though it's spreading everywhere now, the biggest battleground is in the college campuses, where the right to dissent has been completely eliminated. I mean, on a lot of college campuses, you can't say the word Gaza. You cannot. Terrified.
A few months ago, Donald Trump visited several Arab countries and imposed several $1 billion of deals. None of them really talked about Gaza. It was the first time billions could impact the most powerful office. So how complicit are these countries and what is their impact on the genocide? And my second question is, UAE and Saudi Arabia had a very small war about a month ago fighting.
Citizens of those states, it's their responsibility to denounce what their governments are doing, their collaboration, their complicity. Look, in the case of that resolution, honest people have to acknowledge there was a problem. The problem was this. The U.S. said, if you don't sign on to this resolution, we're going to give Israel the green light to do whatever it wants. So it was a form of blackmail. And if you take a country like Algeria, they said that Gazans have suffered so much, anything that will diminish its suffering, we're going to support it. There was an argument there. I'm not dogmatic on these things. But did Algeria have to say that we praise President Trump as a peacemaker who brings peace all over the world? That's what they said. You could have, in the case of China and Russia, they did both say, we're faced with this dilemma, not only because all the Arab Muslim states lined up with the U.S., but also we're faced with the dilemma that if it's going to end the direct genocide, then anything to lessen the horrors of what's going on in Gaza. And that's correct. But then the Chinese and the Russians, they proceeded to describe everything that the U.S. was doing. It was a blockade in the history of the UN. Don't say we didn't warn you. The Arab Muslim states didn't do that. They didn't do that. They just all lined up to curry favor with the United States. It's a very pitiful sight. It's completely forgotten now, but the Saudis, just in Yemen, the numbers are, the Saudis opposed this blockade on Yemen. The numbers are, between 2015 and 2018, that blockade was responsible for killing 100,000 Yemeni children. 100,000 Yemeni children. The rest is so awful. And then they say the Palestinian Authority has to reform. Yeah, a bunch of it's a gerontocracy and a kleptocracy. No doubt about that. But whose standard are we going to use? The democracy in Egypt? The democracy in Jordan? The democracy in Saudi Arabia? Is that the standard that the Palestinian Authority has to reach before it's legitimate? The idea, you know who they put it, there is a international, not just a board of peace, but an international stabilization force they create for Gaza, a UN resolution. And you know who are the lead partners in that international stabilization force? Egypt and Israel. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to stabilization, they're really in a league all their own. Egypt came to power, or I should say, Sisi came to power by conducting the single largest massacre in Arab history, wiping out a minimum of 1,000 unarmed protesters engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience in Rabat Square. And Egypt, that other peacemaker, it created real peace in Gaza. by killing everyone. And they were put in charge of the International Stabilization Force, Egypt and Israel. Pitiful.
Hi. So as we're like in this age of might meets right, this like complete impunity, it's also something that we haven't seen over decades, right? I think you did an incredible comprehensive history, especially from 67 onwards, but even in the UN Resolution 181, it violated the UN Charter of Self-Determination, right? The neighboring countries of Palestine all rejected the notion, and it was the Soviet Union, the US, and other countries that imposed this on Palestine.
47 was, my opinion, 47 was more complicated, but I'm not going to argue that point now.
Yeah, but it's kind of like a canary in the coal mine, right? So I think beautifully put, November 17, 2025, definitive nail in the coffin of international law. And as we see that we are in this age of might meets right, then the tools that I think civil society across the world is quite limited, right? Especially if we don't have some type of like armed revolutionary army that's like across different regions. Correct. So I would like to, I guess, ask you about your, or clarify maybe your position on like non-violent movements such as the BDS and things like that, in which it uses economic pressure, which is one of the small tools that are still relevant to civil society to pressure, and the only means that are kind of available if there is no armed resistant movements.
Well, I don't believe that they are the only means. There are many problems, in my opinion. I have a good knowledge of the subject. There are many problems with the BDS. But at this moment, I believe the main problem is it's not a political movement, it's a cult. Why do I say that? That's a fair question. Why would I say that? It's because politics requires analyzing each situation. A cult simply has a bag full or a handful of slogans. And it tries in every situation to involve this slogan. So the slogan is BDS, BDS. There's another, in my opinion, cult, the flotilla cult. Every time there's every time Gaza's in the news, organize a flotilla. Let's organize another flotilla. Let's organize another flotilla. There's no attempt ever to objectively make a balance sheet. We have history. The BDS began in 2005. It's now more than 20 years later. What has been the balance sheet? How successful has it been as a tactic? How many victories has it scored? Has it made any real dents in Israeli society, in the Israeli economy? What has it achieved? That's what a serious political movement does. Politics is not magic formulas, abracadabra. That's not politics. Right now, I believe, as I've said, the most significant thing we should be doing now is, number one, if you're on a college campus, to fight hard to get back that right to free speech, because it's been lost. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone in this room if I say that since the encampments of 2023, college campuses have been dead. The right to free speech was snatched from the sanctuary of free speech, our colleges and universities. They were supposed to be the sacred spaces for free speech, our colleges and universities. That right has been completely snatched. So I believe, no, right now on our college campuses, the slogan should be BDS. It should be free Gaza, free speech. Linking the issue of Gaza with speech. Free Gaza, free speech. At the local level, non-university level, the focus should be organizing to try to replicate the Mamdani phenomenon on local levels throughout our country. But there is this cult, and the cult says BDS. It repeats the slogan for 21 years without any examination of what have we achieved in 21 years? What's the record? That's not politics, it's a cult. I get a call the other day, there's a group wants to organize another flotilla. Do I want to go on the flotilla? I'm not in principle against it, but there have been so many flotillas. They happen with such frequency now that nobody even knows they happened. There was the last one with Greta Thunberg. Yeah, I got coverage because she was on it. But you have to, that's not politics, in my opinion. Politics is analyzing the balance of forces at any given moment and trying to figure out what's the maximum we can extract from the given moment. Given the balance of forces, what's the maximum we can extract, and to go about trying to achieve that goal. That's what politics is. Right now, there are some possibilities. The balance of forces are such that I think on the local level, we can win significant victories in Mamdani-type campaigns. That's the balance of forces right now. On the college campus level, it's very tough. Very, very tough. Because the universities are terrified of losing the government funding. So they'll do anything Trump says to keep the government money coming. At the beginning, the problem was they were afraid of losing the alumni money, the Jewish billionaires. But insignificant as that is, it pales beside the money coming from the government. So it's a tough battle. But on the other hand, it could win over significant student and faculty support. Even there, it's very tough because administrations are being so British in crushing any dissent. You know, students understandably they pay huge tuitions. So the fear of expulsion, suspension, professors terrified that they're going, I mean, tenured professors are the tenure is being snatched from them. So it's a tough battle. On the other hand, the principle of freedom of speech is so sacred in college campuses, it is possible, I believe, to win that battle. And for me, the enigma is, in the midst of these battles, I could be wrong in the slogan, the targets, you know, mine, it could be wrong. But to just keep repeating like abracadabra, to keep repeating BDS, I just don't get it. Politics is not a magic formula. You're free, but I would like to know, I have to give you the right response.
Sure, I mean, I guess a response would be if you were presented with like a list of achievements of the BDS movement, because like Norway, like the big pension fund divested, right? Caterpillar's, you know, stocks have gone down. They have rebuked the Reebok and
that's just too glib.
Right.
Caterpillar stocks have gone down. There could be 1,000 reasons why their stocks have gone down.
Sure. But
just claim, you know, it used to be a joke. When Yasser Arafat, when his wife Suha got pregnant, because I should say beforehand, Palestinian factions used to take credit for anything that happened in Israel. If a car crashed, Palestinian faction took credit. You know, PDFLP was responsible. if anything interprets. Then the joke was when Yasser Arafat's wife got pregnant, Suha, 3 Palestinian factions took credit. It just caterpillar stock burned down, must be BDS.
That's a fair critique. I shouldn't use that. It was more like there are definitely lists of achievements that the BDS movement has.
I looked at the list.
And I would say, like, if it's trying to mirror something like the fall of the South African apartheid regime, which was mirrored in part from the civil society economic boycott, is that not something to try to support?
Because it's overwhelmingly, I won't say completely, it's overwhelmingly a complete fiction. South African apartheid regime fell because of a very powerful domestic opposition. The South African, the African National Congress, and then the United Democratic Front. It was a huge domestic opposition. DDS did something, or what was called the anti-apartheid sanctions movement, but that's not what brought it down. That's just ridiculous. These are just fictions. I don't know why people in Palestine are trying to organize here, a BDS movement. Shouldn't you try to be organizing there? There's no opposition in the West Bank. There's nothing. There are no mass organizations. It's completely atomized. Shouldn't you be trying to organize there? Doesn't make sense to me.
I'm trying to think of something that I can hang on to that's optimistic.
I'm not pessimistic.
I know, but okay. So, is it just Trump? This is a two-part question. Is it just Trump? After Trump, is there still the kind of international movement that we see through him? Is it just the force of his personality? Will it, when he's gone, whether through election or whether he dies, will there be a change of direction in your mind? And the second part of my question is, Mark Carney gave that stirring speech in the United Nations talking about the middle countries and how they had to, rise up and so on. Now, would you address that?
Well, it's obviously not just Trump. There's no left anymore internationally. It's gone. And the right, the far right, is surging. There's a good chance the far right's going to come to power in the UK pretty soon. In France. There's a real problem in Germany. And there's no counterweight. There's no counterweight. So, it's not just Trump. And it's not just Trump in the second sense. I recognize differences between Biden and Trump. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Yes, there's a level of thuggery in Trump. There's a level of just sheer depravity that does break new ground. It does. It's kind of really breathtaking. I read literature of the Civil War. If you read the speeches back then, the speeches, people like Charles Sumner, he would give in the Senate, brace yourself, 5-hour speeches, and he memorized every word. It was very impressive. Could you imagine what President Trump's presidential papers are going to look like? Could you imagine writing a thesis on President Trump's presidential papers?
You're trying to drive some graduate student crazy.
Big, beautiful that. Big, beautiful that. The biggest, the best is. I would be ashamed to assign a student to write a term paper on his papers. It's the level of degradation. It's very sobering. So I'm not going to deny there are significant differences. However, horrible as this past year has been, I don't think Trump has been responsible for a fraction of the number of deaths that Biden was during the genocide in Gaza.
Right.
It's not even a fraction.
Right.
Gotta be honest about that.
Right.
Do you prefer a smooth, fashionably coiffed Secretary of State like Anthony Blinken to little Marco? I don't know who I prefer. I don't really care much to make that distinction. Now, Blinken was a perfectly intelligent person, and he certainly carried himself like a diplomat. And he was a mass murderer. So I'll recognize the distinction. I'll recognize, yes, Trump has definitely broken new ground. I think, Bernie Sanders was right. He said, he just shook his head. He said, this is a long time ago, this is 2016. He said, this guy's just a pathological liar. He said, every word out of his mouth is a lie. Yeah, it's true. And that breaks new ground. I recognize that. But I'm not so sure. I just can't really weigh which is worse. Marco Rubio or Anthony Blinken, Tony Blinken, or Trump or Biden. My late mother used to use the expression describing the Blinken types. She called them pigs with white clubs. Okay, Trump took off the white clubs. Is it worse? Is it better? I don't know. I know a lot of people will say it's worse, and I respect that opinion. I respect that opinion. It's worse. But I personally, I'm not so sure.
We have one question here.
Card.
Carney was already in my radar the week before because I had noticed his signing of that strategic partnership with China. And it was for me, it was an eye-opening moment because he gave a speech after he signed the agreement. And he carried on as if the United States didn't exist. We have signed a strategic partnership. Yes, we are different countries, we have different cultures, but it's all fine. And he's signing a strategic partnership with China and the US right below Canada. So you figure Trump can't be too happy about that. And where did he get the nerve to do that, I was very surprised. And the next thing you know, he goes to Davos and he gives a speech in which he says, we have to stop pretending nothing has changed. He said something significant has changed. And he was clearly referring to the US in the first place. I won't say he was only referring to the US, because he has a very tough line on Ukraine. I don't agree with him, that's a separate topic. But he was clearly, in the first place, talking to the US. And again, that took a certain amount of courage. On the other hand, he belongs to the global elite. He was the former head of the Bank of Canada. He was then the head of the Bank of England. He is the Davos crowd. He is it. So, can I consider him an ally? I don't know. I think those are tough questions. I'm glad that he's defying the US. And I hope that kind of backbone gets some traction. But I think at the end of the day, we have to look for our own leaders. People who don't come out of the Davos crowd and are not the former head of the Bank of England, but who are a bank guard or a bank teller. And I'm glad that he said what he said, but I still think we have to look for people down below who, if they get the right message, there is a large constituency waiting to support them. I went out campaigning for Mamdani. It was a sobering experience in another way, because the age difference between me and the next member of the Mamdani army was a half century. Mamdani's people, Bernie Sanders people, you could say it went up to the low 30s. Mamdani's people were the low 20s. It was the low 20s. I saw it. These are the people fresh out of college who had to face an epiphany. You know what epiphany is? I have no future and I have a huge amount of debt. Those are the people who went out from Mamdani. I want to look for leadership there. I recognize what he did was good, but a little too smooth for my taste.
We have one question here, thank you, and then we'll go to.
That are the early 20s that have nothing left, their systems are not working for us. So if we organize and put metrics in place on, we're doing this, and it's not 20 years now that we're not repeating the same things and executing the same results, getting the same results, do you think violence does have a part to work in organizing and executing change successfully in the long run?
In my opinion, first of all, on this whole subject of nonviolence, I think there's a huge amount of misunderstanding of what it means. I did at one point in my life, not too long ago, Gandhi's writings come to 110, 500-page volumes. I read 47 of those 500-page volumes. And the Gandhi that comes through is very different than the Gandhi we know filtered through the powers that be. The real Gandhi is not in principle against violence. Actually, the thing he detested most was not violence, it's not true. You know what he detested most? Cowardice. He detested cowardice. And he repeatedly exhorted, if you are too cowardly to defend your rights, don't use my nonviolence as an excuse for not standing up for your rights. And he said, if you're put in a situation where nonviolence won't work, then you should use violence. That's what he said. Anybody who has doubts in that score, I wrote a little book on the topic, and I'm very happy to send it to you as a PDF. The real Gandhi is not the Gandhi that I think has been bequeathed to generations that succeeded him. His view was, and there was an argument there, his view was that the value he detested most was cowardice, and what he honored most was courage. And his view was, it took a lot more courage to be nonviolent than it did to be violent. Now you might wonder, how can that be? Why would nonviolence be more courageous than violence? So you have to understand Gandhi's philosophy. I wouldn't call it philosophy, I would call it doctrine. So, you and you are in a war. You are the enemy to each other. Each of you has a weapon that's called a rifle. You aim your rifle at her, she aims her rifle at you. There's a 50% chance you will get killed, and there's a 50% chance that your enemy will get killed. Is that correct? Okay. But in the Gandhian doctrine of nonviolence, the Satyagraha, that was a follower of Gandhi, the Satyagraha, what they're supposed to do in a war is, if it's you against you, and you're a Satyagraha, I'm quoting Gandhi, you're supposed to march into the line of fire, smilingly and cheerfully, and get blown to bits. That's what you're supposed to do as a Satyagraha. A follower of Gandhi's is supposed to march into the line of fire, smilingly and cheerfully, and get blown to bits. Which means you don't have a 50% chance. You 100% are going to get killed. And so for Gandhi, it took much more courage to be nonviolent than to be violent. Having said that, so Gandhi wasn't in principle against violence. In fact, I don't think it's to his credit, to tell you the truth, there were elements of Indian society who sided with Japan during World War II. Very well-known figures who supported Japan during World War II. Gandhi supported them. Even though they were in the army, I should have said, when I said support Japan, I should have said, there were troops in the Japanese army. Armed troops, obviously. Gandhi supported them. There were Indians. I know Japan was horrible. the history is completely unknown here. We were complete monsters. They killed 26 million Chinese. 26 million Chinese. The Japanese during World War II. As to the question of violence, I'm not a pacifist. I've never pretended to be a pacifist. I'm not saying it proudly. I'm not saying it ashamed. I'm not. During the Vietnam War, there was a famous left-wing folk singer, the hero of my generation, a fellow named Pete Seeger. Anyone know the name? Pete Seeger? Okay. And he wrote many anti-war songs during the Vietnam War, and one of them was called Bring Them Home. There is, like, whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong, I have a right to sing this song. Bring Them Home, bring them home. Now, one of the lyrics in this song went, there is one thing I must confess, I am not a pacifist. If a country invaded this land of mine, I'd be the first one on the firing line. And he said, they bombed us, and they dropped this, and I said, I would fight. And the point he was making was very clear. The point he was making was the Vietnamese had the right to use force to free themselves. If a country invaded this land of mine, I'd be the first one on the firing line. He was defending the right of the Vietnamese to fight for their freedom with armed force. So I'm not going to deny them the right to use armed force, but I think a rational political actor recognizes that it should be the last option, not only because taking a life is wrong, even though that's a good enough reason, but there's another reason, and for me, in many ways, it's the more compelling reason. The reason is, in war, in armed resistance, it's the most ruthless to always win the power battles inside the resistance. You have to be very brutal and very ruthless to rise to the top in an armed resistance. If you show any softness, if you show any weakness, if your conscience tugs at you at certain moments, you're going to lose the battle for power. And so the people who end up being the leaders of that movement are, I think, a little bit too ruthless and thick-skinned for my taste. I'm not saying there may not be an occasion, a necessity for that. I can see it. But to make it simple, we should always be cognizant of the corrupting effect of any armed resistance. Because anybody with conscience and softness will lose the battle. They will. And you're going to get leaders you're not going to like. Now maybe at certain points that has to be. I'm not going to deny it. But we have to recognize it as a last resort. For two reasons. There's the moral reason, and then there is, you could call it the prudential reasons, reasons of prudence. We don't want people rise to the top in our movement who are completely ruthless. It's just not a good thing. So, that's what I see.
Let's combine the last two questions, and then you can answer them together. So Judge Griffin and then yourself.
This question is a follow-up to the one you just asked.
That's fine.
Given that war is necessarily brutal, violent, and as you mentioned, requires an element of ruthlessness that is not consistent with political society as we know it.
As we desire.
As we desired. And given that history has taught that no fascist regime has ever been ousted from power without violent resistance. In the face of the current fascist upsurge in the society, and the face of ICE having invaded Minnesota and being pervasive throughout the country, the history of the United States and the Civil War comes to mind. If 2/3 of a million people died during the Civil War, is it conceivable in your mind that the United States could happen upon or find itself faced with a situation where there was something akin to a civil war or a national guerrilla movement? Not because it's politically correct, but because people have decided that the institutions no longer work and that individual acts of violence are not reasonable, and so some kind of collective insurgency or counterinsurgency movement is justified, albeit painfully.
Look, I've said I don't rule that out as a possibility, but we have to be clear, in my opinion, we're nowhere near that. We haven't even begun. I haven't even taken the first step towards trying to organize people and seeing what kind of power they might possess to stop this insanity. We haven't even begun the work of organization. I said I recognize violence as a last option. We haven't begun the first, second, and third options. I want to wait to see what the people of Minneapolis can do if they work together. And if others come in. I mean, during the civil rights movement, a lot of people from the North, I'm not saying a significant portion, but a lot of people from the North went down south to join with the movement. And in a larger number, they boycotted places like Woolworths and other outlets which had franchises in the South, which were segregationists. So there's all sorts of activities that occurred in the North to try to support the work in the South. We haven't begun to explore what are our possibilities. I think very soon, we're going to have a test of that in New York City. There's going to be a battleground. The Trump people, the billionaire class in New York, that Upper East Side, they will pull all the plugs to stop Mamdani. And then we're going to have to see what can the balance of forces allow for. I don't know. I happen to think Trump is not the problem. I don't. Maybe I'm a minority in one. The problem is nobody challenges him. I mean, the level of backbone is nothing. Has anybody tried to stop him? They just line up to lick his shoes. They just line up. It's so pitiful.
Yeah.
He got a few bad words on Greenland, and it seems he capitulated today. Nobody tries. I think it'll be very tough with ICE. I think it'll be very tough with ICE. I'm waiting to see what's going to happen when they come to New York. I'm already worried I'll have problems with my landlord if they break down my door. I really am. I think about it. I mean, the scenes are really kind of crazy. 10 ICE people with rifles aimed at a house and breaking down the door. I mean, these are just complete Nazis. Is the answer now to talk about violence? I think that's crazy. Now you'll just all be mowed down. At some point in the future, I don't want to predict. But I think we have to be very careful about striking militant poses for cameras. It's a serious business, and it in my opinion, it rarely ends well because of the people who end up in power. I've seen that over and over again. I've seen it. I remember just a little example in Grenada, nobody remembers it anymore, but the mutual movement with Maurice Bishop in the 1980s. And Maurice Bishop, tiny little country in the Caribbean, Grenada. And he headed up a leftist movement called the Mutual Movement. And he seemed to be a decent fellow. And then there was a hardcore faction, for those of you who remember these tiny pieces of radical trivia, named the Cords, Bernard Cord and his wife. They decided Maurice Bishop wasn't radical enough, and so they proceeded to line him up and shoot him and his pregnant girlfriend dead. And then the US used that as a pretext to invade Grenada. It was in 1983. It was a week after the Marine barracks was blown up in Lebanon. The US Marine barracks was blown up in Lebanon, and Reagan wanted a diversion from that because it was a disaster. Was it 269 or 369? I can't remember. US soldiers were killed. He needed diversion from that disaster, and so he chose Grenada as an excuse. But they provided the excuse. The courts decided that Maurice Bishop wasn't a militant enough Marxist, so they killed him. And it happens over and over again. I've seen it, I lived through it. So that's made me, I'm not going to say that I won't be part of a movement that believes in guns, and that's stupid. But I say you have to always be cognizant of the dangers that lurk and not turn violence like BDS to turn it into a cult. You have to always, politics are repeated to the point of tedium. Politics is about assessing the balance of political forces in any particular moment, and then trying to figure out what is the maximum we can achieve at this particular moment. And then you formulate a slogan for it. And Mamdani was very good. He had his ear to the ground, so to speak. He came up with the slogan of affordability, which is, I said to people last night at a dinner, a private dinner, I said, had I been on his team, I would say, no, horrible slogan. Affordability, too many syllables, doesn't have a melodic sound to it. It's so clunky. But now, when they open the news, everybody's there, or left, right, center. They're all talking about affordability, so he was right, and I was wrong. He found the right slogan, and he also found the right issues. He focused on freezing the rent, free buses, free childcare, and he was able to build a coalition around it. So that's what politics is. And right now, to talk about violence, you might as well talk about the man on the moon. It has no connection to where we are right now. It's just an invitation to the government to mow you down.
So we'll conclude with this last question right here.
I had a couple of things I wanted to pick your brain about. One being, what your advice would be to a young person who has, thoughts of doing something political, like you said, with Montgomery's campaign, but doesn't feel they have the knowledge or wisdom to lead the populace in that way. And my second question is, do you think that there is a legal framework that would support an action such as citizens' arrest towards ICE agents that are operating outside of the law?
I would say the last question, I think it's useful for you to sit down and read about the Fugitive Slave Act and how they crafted arguments in favor of stopping the slave hunters, even though it was the law of the land. I myself am curious, and I want to read more about that particular aspect of the resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act. I would like to see, I would be like Charles Sumner. He just said, in my view, the Fugitive Slave Act is unconstitutional. He knew the Constitution like nobody else. He was a very brilliant fellow. And so it would require us, and I'm sure a lot of lawyers have already done it, to try to prove that ISIS activities are unconstitutional. For example, one of the arguments against the Fugitive Slave Act was the slave who was no longer technically a slave because he or she was in a free state, that they didn't get due process, that they were forced to go back by the slave hunters before they got due process, right to a trial, present evidence, cross-examine, and so forth. And I think that argument works with ICE. The people are being taken by them, they're not getting due process. Now, I'm sure there's all sorts of complicated arguments about, well, these are not, they're illegal aliens, and therefore they're not entitled to constitutional rights. But slaves weren't entitled to constitutional rights either. They were slaves. So, I think we need, there's room for everyone in the revolution. And we need to consult what lawyers are saying now, what the ACLU is saying, what the various defenders of the various refugee laws, what kind of law they're using. And then, obviously, you have to then simplify it into a slogan or something to defend what you're doing. Ultimately, it's not going to be the word of the law. Ultimately, it's going to be the public image that this whole ICE thing is getting. And it's getting that PR. I think we can all, everybody can agree on that one. People even who have doubts on the immigration issue, who think that maybe there are too many immigrants in the day, no, this has gotten a little bit off the rails. And that's how you win public opinion. And then you try to organize it. I think it will take a lot of courage. And I was watching the people in Minneapolis and I'm talking, well, but I go right up to the ICE people and say, you're a fucking Nazi. Get out of here. Those ICE people are crazy. Trump talked about the people from Somalia, and he said low IQ. I thought he was talking about ICE. So, yeah, I think that's, we have to look at the law. and see what the law allows. But I would say ultimately it's not going to be the law won't be the deciding issue. The deciding issue is going to be public perception of whether this is acceptable in our country. And I think public opinion is turning against it. Too many images that just don't sound very, don't look very American. 10 people lined up, aiming their rifles, and then breaking down the door. Nah, that's gone too far. It's gone too far. As to your first question, guess what? It's not for you to decide whether you'll be a leader or not. You put yourself forward. If you have a track record, if you show leadership qualities, you'll be chosen. That's what the people's movement is about. You don't impose yourself on the movement. You prove yourself in the movement. And if you have the stuff, I think you'll make it. But it requires, I think, a lot of energy. I don't know how Mom Donnie does it. This guy seems to have to not just squeeze 48 hours and 24 hours. And it will take a lot of courage. I think, even though I don't want to talk about violence now, I think sooner rather than later, there are going to be a lot of martyrs in this cause. I do believe that. I can see it coming. Because that ruling elite is so ruthless, so greedy, so convinced that everything they have they're entitled to. Such nasty, nasty human beings. You know what Trump is? At the end of the day, you know what he is. I'll tell you what he is. There'll be a little story by Constantine. So I lived in 72 units. I had a wonderful super. Super's name is Elvis. Wonderful guy. Everybody loved Elvis. He was the kind of guy who worked over hours ever, extra hours when anybody needed him. Never complained or always smiling. Everybody loved Elvis. And then about a month ago, there was a little fire in his office. Nothing heard, some billowing smoke, it was a little fire. I should say Elvis is from Jamaica, the island of Jamaica. And he had worked there 15 years in our building. 15 years. And he got fired. And they gave him 30 days to pack up and leave. And they did it on Christmas week. And everybody knew he just turned 60. Which means there's no possibility he'll get a job as a super that's out at 60. And his mother was dying of cancer. And we went around and we signed a petition for him. I was surprised. My building is very heterogeneous, probably a dozen different languages. And many don't know any apart from their birth language. So, given the current climate, and a lot of the people in the building are immigrants. So, I figured, given the current political climate, people are going to be afraid to sign a petition. And secondly, I don't know how I'm going to communicate with them because I don't know 10 or 12 languages. You know, we knocked on the door, and believe it or not, everybody signed the petition. There were 2 Jewish people who didn't sign it because it was a Sabbath night. It was Friday night. They said, just come back. And when the Sabbath is over, and we'll sign it. Did the landlord reply? No. And then I wrote a very long letter to the landlord. I tried to be diplomatic about it. He never replied. Now the landlord owns about 10 very pricey buildings. He didn't work for anybody, he just inherited from his father. I knew his father. Throw out a guy just turned 60, worked 15 years, everybody loved him, for one mistake. What was Trump before he was president? He was a real estate developer. That's them. That's them. That's what it means to be a real estate, a property owner in our country. So ruthless, so heartless. That's what we're up against. Trump is just a real estate developer. That's his MO. That's what we're up against. The greed, the ruthlessness, and the sense of entitlement. Every cent that we've got, it's owing to us. There are going to be a lot of martyrs. It's going to be a very tough struggle. So, you have to figure out whether you're ready for that. You know, Gandhi smiles and smiles and smiles. I'm tired of the smile, to tell you the truth. But I'm sure at night at home, there's a lot of worry about where this is headed. And when, not if, but when will be to show that these people will wreck the city, wreak mayhem and pandemonium before they'll let him succeed. In their minds, we spent $40 million in the election, he spent $1 million. Why didn't we get our way? We should have gotten our way. We spent $40 million. Why did he win with $1 million? That's not fair. Yeah, in their minds it's not fair. So it's a very tough battle. And it's just not the time to be talking about armed resistance. It's figuring out how in this situation, how do you find a path? How do you carve out a path? I don't know. It's very, very tough. But there's not really a choice. You know that famous line, it was Father Nemo. Was it Father? Or, I forgot his name. Look it up, Niemoller. Anyone have it?
N-O-N-N.
No, Niemoller.
What, am I getting correct?
You found it?
Yes.
Yeah, what was the famous line by him? You know, it was a series of lines. They came from the trade unionists and I didn't do anything. They came from the communists and I didn't do anything. They came from the socialists, I didn't do anything. They came from the Jews, I didn't do anything. And then they came for me and it was too late.
There was no one to speak out for me. No one
Yes.
left. Yes.
Nobody left. We don't really have a choice. We do not. Unless you want to live in slavery. I really believe that. We're in a very difficult moment right now. And you can ignore what they're doing to the immigrants, because are not immigrant. But then they start rounding up the people who support the immigrants, and then they start rounding up the people who support those who support the immigrants, and then they start rounding up everybody. It's a very tough moment, but especially young people, you just have to hold and pray they find the courage and the energy and the vision and the leadership to do something.
Very good. I just have a few announcements before we conclude. There are books by Finkelstein right there. They're free for you to take with you. And then February 7th, just mark that on your calendars as the screening for The Voice of Hinduja, which is Oscar nominated as of 7 o'clock this morning. And let's join an applause for Griffin just reminded me, February 3rd is February 2nd is the deadline to register. March 3rd is the day for voting, but February 19th, I think, February 17th is early voting.
And if you're absentee voting, the absentee ballots are going out now, so you need to, if you guys write absentee ballots, talk to them now.